interesting story coming out from the Supreme Court. There is a Texas death penalty case. The gentleman sentenced to death, and you can see his picture on the screen, Dwayne Buck, was convicted of murder, and then he was sentenced to death. During his sentencing, or during the trial, a psychologist who was, and I have to listen closely to this because it's rather ridiculous. There was a psychologist who testified that Dwayne Buck was more prone to commit violence again due to the fact that he was black. Yes, let me repeat that. Due to the fact that he was black, this psychologist testified that Dwayne Buck is more likely to commit a violent act again. And this was a part of both his conviction as well as his sentencing. This ultimately led to a Supreme Court case, and we'll discuss that in a second. The other portion of this that is so fascinating is the fact that it wasn't the prosecutors who introduced this testimony. It was his defense attorney who hired this psychologist. And upon examination of this psychologist, or questioning of this psychologist, the psychologist said that Dwayne Buck is more likely to commit another violent act due to the fact that he was black. So a little backstory on what happened with Buck, or what he's guilty of. So this is not a question of whether he's guilty or not, is of whether or not whether he did warranted the death penalty. Dwayne Buck shot and killed his ex-girlfriend in front of her 3 children while she begged for her life. He also killed a man that he thought she was cheating on him with, and he shot his stepsister. The stepsister survived. The man and his girlfriend, his ex-girlfriend, both died. And this was in front of the three children as she begged for her life. So in Texas, in order for the death penalty for them to give you the death penalty, a jury needs to be convinced that the defendant will commit violence again before they can sentence him or her to death. So this psychologist who testified provided a pivotal piece for the sentence of death, which was, yes, we believe he's going to commit this violent act again. His justification for it was because he was black. Stay the hell out of Texas, people. So there are other similar cases involving the same psychologist. Those cases went to the Supreme Court in 2000, and Texas admitted that this was wrong. Previously, in other cases, it was the prosecutors who introduced this psychologist to give this testimony that because he's black, he's prone to do this type of violence again. So in the case with Dwayne Buck, it came from the defense attorney, which we'll talk about that in a minute. But Texas previously used the same psychologist to say the same exact thing, which helped lead to sentencing of death of other convicted murderers. This case went to the Supreme Court. There hasn't been a decision made as of yet, but it's really kind of hinging on the question of, is there any difference between the prosecutors introducing this racist testimony or the defense attorney introducing this racist testimony? And I believe Ruth Bader Ginsburg, it was Ruth, right? It was RGB. She actually questioned, does that even matter? Right? Because the reason Dwayne Buck wasn't given the proper appeal in the first place was because they testified, they stated that this racist psychologist was hired by the defense attorney. Now, in all the other cases, this psychologist was hired by the prosecutors, and the prosecutors were trying to get a conviction and trying to get the death penalty. They're trying to get everything they could get in these cases. And so they were responsible at that point for hiring this racist psychologist who used race as a means of justifying the death penalty. So clearly those are cases that should have been appealed. And now the question is, well, since it was his defense attorney who actually hired the same psychologist to give the same racist testimony, should Dwayne Buck be allowed to have a new sentencing? And so some of the justices actually asked this question, and I believe maybe it was Ginsburg, but the question that was asked was, not only does it matter whether or not it came from the defense attorney or the prosecutors, but is this not an example of just gross negligence and just poor representation? I mean, this is a defense attorney who hired a witness, a psychologist to get on the stand. I was going to say stage, to get on the stand and then get this unbelievably racist testimony out of him, which led to the sentencing of death. So it's either gross negligence and poor representation because maybe Dwayne Buck couldn't afford a good defense attorney. Maybe this is, I don't know. It didn't indicate. This was reported on by Nina Totenberg from NPR. Maybe this was a case of a public defender not knowing, or maybe a new public defender not knowing what the hell he's doing. Or maybe, and I'm just throwing this out here, right? Because maybe this defense attorney knew exactly what the hell he was doing, because he knew in these previous cases, this same psychologist who gave the same exact racist testimony led to appeals and new sentencing. So maybe he knew his defendant was going to be found guilty, and he just used this as a means of undermining the sentencing. I don't know, but it will be interesting to see how the Supreme Court actually rules on this. And whether or not it matters that this racist testimony came from the prosecutor. Whether this racist testimony came from the defense attorney versus the prosecutor. So it'll be an interesting story. I'm not really sure. I'd love to hear what you think. Do you think the lawyer was just so grossly incompetent that he hired someone who undermined his defendant, his client? Or do you think this defense attorney was doing a brilliant strategy of working on the appeal before the conviction was even issued? All right. I want to hear you. I definitely want to read your comments on that. I think that would be interesting.